Hi, everyone. Welcome to An Evening with Silas House, hosted by the Kentucky Book Festival, a program of Kentucky Humanities. I'm Sarah Woods, the director of the Kentucky Book Festival, and I'm so glad you've joined us tonight. This is the first of a series of 4 virtual events leading up to the 40th annual Kentucky Book Festival, happening November 1st through November 6th. Kentucky Book Festival programs would not be possible without the generous support of our sponsors. Tonight's event is brought to you by First Southern National Bank. As participants in this event, I have just a few reminders. If you'd like to submit a question, please do so by using the Q&A feature in Zoom or by leaving a comment if you're watching on Facebook. And don't forget to check out kybookfestival.org for event updates. Now, on to the show. Silas House is the best-selling author of 6 novels, 1 book of creative nonfiction, and 3 plays. His debut novel, Clay's Quilt, is celebrating its 20th anniversary on March 30th. That's what we're here for today. Tonight's moderator, Angela Carell, is the author of the May Hollow trilogy and the founder of Kentucky Soaps and Such in beautiful downtown Stanford, Kentucky, which is part of a family of businesses included in the Wilderness Road Hospitality Group founded by her and her husband, Jess. Now sit back, relax, grab your favorite quilt, and enjoy An Evening with Silas House. Angela, take it away.
Thank you, Sarah. Well, Silas, it is so good to be with you tonight. And I read Clay's Quilt when it came out 20 years ago. Loved it then. Listened to it on audio the second time, which was a really wonderful experience, and actually found it even more meaningful. So I don't know if I matured, or I don't know what, maybe I was connecting more with Easter and Anna than I did, when I was 20 years younger. But I just loved it, of course, again. And I wanted to ask you, what does it feel like as an author to look back on these 20 years? Your book first, came out, your very first book, and now 20 years later to actually be sitting here and talking about it tonight.
Well, I've been doing that a lot lately as I think about the 20th anniversary. Excuse me. And one thing I've been thinking a lot about is just how I had no idea what I was doing, and I was just, I had been a voracious reader, so I really learned how to write by reading. But I think Clay's Quilt is so much about storytelling, that growing up around so many storytellers really fed this book in a different way. And so readers tell me all the time that the reason they like this book in particular is because they feel as if they're being told a story, and that it's comforting in that way. Even though there's some disturbing, gritty things going on in the book, there's a lot of violence, drug use, broken families, things like that. But it's sort of all couched in these stories being told, and this deep love for family and a deep love for place. So somehow, I think the fact that I didn't really know what I was doing gives it a kind of a specialness that I couldn't have created that on my own, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense, but you definitely knew what you were doing when you wrote it, even though you may not have felt it. It's a beautiful book. And I thought maybe before I go into some other questions, if I could ask you to read just a little bit. I think after listening to the audiobook and hearing the cadence of speech and the accents, I think everybody would just love to hear you read.
I'm going to read a scene that I think is really appropriate for right now. It's set in the springtime, which is one reason that I'll be clearing my throat throughout our time together. So I apologize, but my allergies are acting up like most people in Kentucky. But this happens in the last third of the book. The morning he was to be married, Clay went for a walk up into the mountain. The air was thick with the new smells of spring, and the woods were so filled with sighs and whispers that he thought this might be the way it had sounded before people ever came to these hills. He stopped for a moment, listening to the birds singing above him, the ones that called from far across the holler. The wind spread itself through leaves the color of green water. Many days before, he had noticed the hills growing red with buds, but only now did he realize that winter was over. It seemed to Clay that seasons crept up slowly, hardly changing their progress from day to day. And then one morning, they were suddenly and finally here. Spring had come overnight, sneaking in, the blooms working throughout the darkness to be ready when sunlight hit the mountainsides. He considered the sounds of the mountain, listened for something more, and felt the desire to go on, as if someone were pushing him from behind. The first trees to show their new colors, sarvice, redbud, dogwood, were in bloom, and their petals pushed at his face as he made his way up the old trail. Maybe only a child could find that field of wildflowers his mother had loved, he thought. Maybe he had been the one who had led his mother there. Perhaps he had not been meant to go back there yet. Maybe it was still too soon, but he wanted to find it. Maybe that was where her spirit stayed now. When he was a child, he had often imagined that the morning mist was his mother's ghost, easing down the mountain to seep out over the valley, and watched him. When he got older, he was dismayed by how the white fog always burned away by mid-morning. A field of wildflowers would be a better place to think of her living.
Oh, that's beautiful. That was one of my favorite scenes in the book. Just it all kind of came together there. But talk a little bit about this sense of place. It's so rich. I mean, you infuse your writing with smell, sounds, music. You just feel like you're in Crow County. And tell me a little bit about where Crow County is.
Well, I sort of combined 3 counties in southeastern Kentucky that I know really well: Laurel County, Clay County, and Leslie County. And so I just made a composite of those, and I called it Crow County after the Crow Indian tribe, which I grew up hearing a lot about, where I grew up in Laurel County, especially. I really just wanted to create my own world, but also give it the elements of the world that I knew so well. And I really wanted to share the culture that I grew up in. People have this idea that Appalachia is monolithic, that it's all the same. And I mean, it's different from county to county. It's different from holler to holler. There are many Appalachias. There are many different ways of speaking, many Appalachian accents and dialects, and et cetera. So all I could really do was present that little part of the world that I knew. And of course, the natural world was a really big part of that. I think when you're from a place of mountains and valleys and hills and pastures and coal mining, economies that, are environmental in nature, you can't help but be aware of the natural world in a much deeper way. I mean, in Kentucky, for instance, we have so many rivers and creeks. They dictate so much about where we build things, how long it takes to get somewhere, whatever. In Eastern Kentucky, as the crow flies, something might be 15 minutes away, but when you have to go all the way around a mountain to get to it, you're aware of that mountain, is my point.
That's true.
Yeah. And I grew up outside. I was really lucky to grow up in Lilly, Kentucky, mostly. It was about 500 people at the time. And I really felt like I knew everybody in the community, and I was kin to most of them. And we just stayed out in the woods and played in the creek. And I just like, that's one of the things I feel most fortunate about, is that I had that as a child. I worry so much about children who don't have that opportunity to be. It's more than being outside. It's about being in tune, being really in touch with the natural world in a way that we were.
Knowing the names of trees and the names of the flowers and of the sarvice and all of those things.
Right.
Yeah. So tell me about, I know people are out there are going to want to know, is this semi-autobiographical, or do you infuse your own story into this or into some of the characters? I think I read that Anna maybe was your grandmother's name. So maybe tell me a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, it gets complicated when I try to explain it because really I am in every one of the characters. Um, and the book is not autobiographical. None of this happened to me. None of the characters are 100% real. But there are only two of my books where I can really point to people that the characters are totally based on. And that's Clay's Quilt and Eli the Good are my most autobiographical books in that way. The character of Aneth in this book is sort of a combination of my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, excuse me, I'm sorry, and my aunt, my mother's sister, who was such a huge influence in my life. My grandmother died before I was born, and her name was Anna. And she was just known as this free, wild spirit. Everybody in the area knew who she was. She was like, movie star gorgeous, always dressed to the hilt, very fashionable. Worked as a, worked as a waitress in a little cafe in Hyden, Kentucky. Had a really hard, rough life, etc. And then I brought in my aunt Sis, who I just, studied my entire life. She died in 2015. And up until that point, she was just such a source for stories and just watching the way she moved through the world. So that character is very much based on her and my grandmother. And then other characters are based on composites of people I knew. And I think, Clay, I'm only like Clay in that Clay is really introspective. He's always thinking and he's always worried and his love for the natural world. Those are the ways that I'm like him. And sometimes I'm not like a character, but characters have traits that I really wish I had. For instance, I would love to be able to play the fiddle. And so in a way, I'm able to live vicariously through a character like Alma, who is just this virtuoso, on the fiddle. So that's one of the things I love the most about writing is being able to live through somebody else's skin while I'm working on that character. Mm-hmm. Now, the most autobiographical element foundationally about this novel is that my uncle was murdered when I was 11 years old.
Really?
And I was just so aware of the way that changed our family and the reverberations it had over years and in the whole community. It just changed everything for us. Mm-hmm. I combined that experience with seeing that a lot of media about rural working class people is really violent. And in these portrayals, rural working class people are almost always portrayed as sort of violent without a conscience. But they just kill people and they don't think another thing about it, And so I wanted this book to really be an indictment of violence and to really home in on the way violence doesn't just take that life of that one person, who's been killed, but how it affects their children and their whole family and people in the community and people who love them and the murderer's family and etc. And so I wanted it to be a sort of new kind of Appalachian novel in that it was really showing Appalachian characters and exhibiting deep remorse for the violence that they were participating in. Mm-hmm. So to me, that's a big part of what the book's about. And I really do feel like it helped me and my family to work through some of the difficulties that were brought on by my uncle's murder. And one thing was that the storytelling in my family changed because they began to feel it was too painful to tell stories about my Uncle Jack. And so they would just avoid it, and those stories would go quiet. And that's one reason that I started writing down stuff as a child, was because I saw that happening. And it was a long time before they felt comfortable talking about that in the same way they had before. And so in a way that really gave birth to me as a writer.
Yeah, that's fascinating. you mentioned, about the violence, and I noticed that there is a lot of symbolism with red, the color red, and then the red bird. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that too, especially the contrasting against the starkness of winter. So tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I always say symbolism only works if you do it unconsciously. If you go in there and try to insert symbols and motifs, then it doesn't work. And so I had written the whole book before I realized the way that the redbirds in particular were working. To me, they are symbols of Anath, this wild, free, strong spirit. But really, Anath and the redbirds are representative of rural working class people,
Mm.
or you could say country people, or Appalachian people, or Kentuckians, or whatever lens you want to put on it. In that, I think, if you think about redbirds or cardinals, whatever you want to call them, we think of them as just these tough birds. They don't go away for the winter; they tough it out, right? But yet they're so beautiful and fragile, and I just think there's a complexity there that often gets left out about country people, and that makes the redbirds a really good sort of epitomizing force for that. And just like you said, it starts out with this book moves through all the seasons, and that's really important for the book, I think. And it's one reason that people talk a lot about my use of the natural world, is because I'm moving through all the seasons. Very conscious. I was very consciously doing that because we're seeing Clay create his own story. His whole life he's been overshadowed by the story of his mother's murder and her wild, free life before that. And so he wants to create his own life. So we see him move through those seasons. But yeah, the book starts out in the wintertime, and it's a very stark, all that whiteness, white and black and gray. And then the redbirds are the only real color. And you combine that with the blood, on the snow of her being murdered. So it all really works. When the book is very much written in the style of a film, in that films, tend to be a collection of short scenes, and each scene has a beginning, middle, and end. Instead of, in a lot of novels, you have these big, long scenes that don't necessarily have that same structure. And so I think that helps to make the book more cinematic in that way. And so I'm using a lot of color. I think a lot about color palette and things like that when I'm creating a book, like when I'm putting it together in my mind. That's just the way that every novelist has to figure out a way to work. You're spending so long with a book that you have to do all these things to be in for that long haul. Yeah, I must have worked 7 or 8 years on Clay's quilt. And so that's one of the things that I really spend a lot of time on, is thinking about it visually.
Well, I saw it visually, and I was sitting, at times it was so vivid to me that I almost felt like I was watching a movie. That's how vivid the descriptions were. And so I don't even know that I need to see the movie now when it comes out. Hopefully, will there be a movie?
Well, I said it was bought by the movies twice, but it didn't make it. And you just, it's such a tricky business. You never know.
Yeah, tricky business. Well, we'll hope for that, but I don't think that we really need it. We have the book. I want to talk to you about a parallel between, I noticed when I was reading the scenes in the honky tonk and then the scenes in the Pentecostal church had some similarities. Really. I mean, you had the music in the honky tonk, and then the Holy Ghost in the church, and there was this sort of sense of community. There's just a sense of sort of giving over to either the music or the Holy Ghost. And I almost thought that they were kind of running on parallel tracks at times.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I was raised in the Holiness Church, which is a kind of Pentecostal church. And probably the the thing I loved most about it was the music. The music was so raucous, and uh, it's almost like rock and roll. There's almost always a big drum set,
Mhm.
electric guitars, bass guitars, singers who are really just belting it out. A lot of really up tempo music. Um, People running the aisles, what we would call shouting, speaking in tongues. It's so passionate, and I think that's one thing that I loved about it as a child. I loved that these people who were so mild mannered normally, um, they weren't people who talked a lot about themselves or things like that, but in the church, it was just a whole different thing. Being on display, and this overcome with emotion, a lot of emotion. Growing up around men who didn't show a lot of emotion, and going to church where men were often showing more emotion than women were, and just things like that was so complicated and interesting for me as a child. When you're raised holiness or in a fundamentalist church, usually around the age of 16 or 17, you either fully embrace the church all the way, or you leave it and you go wild. And I went wild. And so, once I started going out to bars and to parties and things like that, and seeing those parallels, I did think a lot about that, and how in some ways they were so opposites, but also doubles. And as a novelist, you're just always looking for I'm always looking for opposites and doubles to play with in a book, because conflict arises out of opposites and doubles. And so that's one thing, that you do have really both things going on, the opposites and the doubles here with the church and the bar scene. Um,
Because they're naturally going to be at conflict, right? At some
yeah.
point.
Yeah. I mean, well, for one thing, Clay is constantly under Easter's microscope. She doesn't want him being, out in those bars. She doesn't want him going wild. Um, Not only because she doesn't think it's safe, but also because she thinks this will keep him from getting into heaven. And that's her main, as his parental figure, that's her main responsibility, she feels, is to make sure that he makes the right choices to end up in the right, the right place. And that was definitely the case in my family, that religion um, totally took over. And even people in my family who were wild and going out to bars and, whatever, were still very conscious of the church. I mean, it went beyond the church. It was cultural.
Right.
Religion
Respect
was.
and
Yeah. Yeah.
well, you kind of hit on too earlier with the storytelling, and then even a little bit just now with the tuning your ear into like the dialogue and the what you're hearing. The music obviously is strong in the book, but your dialogue is spot on. If you have grown up in Kentucky, or had these rural roots, Appalachian background, it is spot on. So I know I know you've honed that, but you've also must have a bit of an ear for it, like music maybe, or have you consciously, worked on that aspect?
All of the above. I think one thing is that, like I said, I grew up in the church, and some of those church services lasted 3 and 4 hours. We went 3 or 4 nights a week, and that makes you into an observer, And I mean, so I was really listening to the way people phrased things. I was watching everything. I wasn't allowed to take any toys, but I was allowed to take a notebook and a pencil, and so I would write things down. The other thing is that my Aunt Dot ran a community store, a little country store, and people would just come there and hang out, for an hour or two, and they'd sit around and um, eat crackers and pickle bologna and candy bars, and gossip and talk, and I would just sort of slink into the shadows and listen, eavesdrop on everything. I was always going up under the porch and eavesdropping, listening, to people. And I would also ask the elders in my family to tell me stories and sit them down and kind of force them to do that. Um, I just grew up around people who were always talking, they were always telling something. Um, and at the same time, it's a really hard thing to pull off, rural speech, because you have to strike this balance. If you go a little too far, it's going to come off like hee-haw. But then if you don't go far enough, it's going to be bland, and it's not going to have the richness that the dialect has. And so striking that balance is always a hard thing for me. I've published 6 novels now. My 7th novel comes out next year, but I noticed that with each book, I use less dialect and I use more syntax. I play more with the way that we form sentences, and I use more colloquial words, like just specific words that we use. And I don't spell things out so phonetically, because I think I can strike that balance better. But that's something I worked really hard in Clay's Quilt, because I wanted readers to know the richness of the language, but I also never wanted it to come off as if I was condescending to the characters, or trying to make the characters look bad in any way. That was never my intention. And so I think that is one of the things I'm proudest of, I think, with the book, is the use of dialect.
Well, it felt so comfortable being with these characters and hearing how they talk, especially since I listened to it on audio. It just felt like being with family. So we're talking about Clay's Quilt, but there's actually 2 other books that are connected, Parchment of Leaves and The Cold Tattoo. So can you tell me a little bit about how they're connected and the order of things?
Well, I had already started writing a Parchment of Leaves before I sold Clay's Quilt, because, I thought, I'm going to try to get Clay's Quilt published. I'm going to put it out there in the world. But if I just obsess about getting it published, I may never write anything again. So I launched right into writing another book as soon as I finished Clay. And so I had, I don't know, maybe 50 or 100 pages of Parchment Leaves written before Clay's Quilt came out. And I didn't know that those 2 books were connected at all until I started writing my 3rd novel. And in my 3rd novel, I really wanted to write about my mother and her sister, who had such a beautiful and complicated relationship, because they were sisters, but they also had somewhat of a mother-daughter relationship. And that led to some real conflict, but also this profound love that I've just never seen any other 2 people share in quite the same way. So I wanted to write about this sibling relationship. So I didn't know what to call them. So I just called them my mother and my aunt's real names. But as I got into the book, I was about, I don't know, a third of the way through. And then I realized this is Eastern Aneth from Clay's Quilt. Of course it is, because I've also based Easter on my mother, and I based Aneth on my aunt. So of course this is Eastern Aneth, And so I thought, why not just make it a prequel? Clay's Quilt. A lot of people were asking me for a sequel to Clay's Quilt at that point, and I had nothing in me to do that. But this came very naturally to write the prequel. And so The Cold Tattoo is the most enjoyable writing experience I've had. I just loved spending time with those characters. I loved the situations that they got in. In a way, it's a lot about rock and roll coming to the rural South. It's about country, one sister's a little bit country, one's a little bit rock and roll, that sort of thing. So I love the way that it looks at country music, and the deep love that rural people have for country music, but also the love for rock and roll. And So yeah, I always hope people will. I always tell people you don't have to read the whole trilogy. They all stand on their own, but I
Mhm.
do think it makes for a richer reading experience if you read the whole thing. So anyway, once I got into writing The Cold Tattoo, then I thought, well, it makes perfect sense that Vine from A Parchment from the Leaves is their grandmother, and so then it all the pieces just work together. And like I said earlier, I think if I had set out to do that, it wouldn't have worked as well, but because it was just organic, it works pretty well. Now, having said that, once I realized that it was a prequel, I had to go back and read Clay's Quilt very closely to make sure that it all, and partially, to make sure that it all worked.
Right.
And I was somewhat limited because the letter in Clay's Quilt really tells you so much about Anna's life story that I had to stick to that letter,
Mhm.
when I was writing a much expanded version of her life in The Cold Tattoo.
That's right. That's right. But it worked beautifully. I loved all three of those. I loved something about all three of them. Do you have a favorite? Can I ask that question, or is it like having children and you can't say you have a favorite?
Yeah, I do think that it's I can't really do that. So I always usually say my favorite's my most recent one because that's the one I'm promoting, right? But um, I think that I love each of them in different ways, and there are things that I would like to change about each of them in retrospect. Um, but I think that I have an allegiance to Clay's Quilt because it gave me a career as a writer, and I really thought that some people in my family and some people from Eastern Kentucky would read Clay's Quilt, and that would be it. And I just wanted a book published. I wasn't setting out to have a career as a writer, and I certainly didn't think that it would be widely read. So
Mm.
I think in a way that frees the writer. It gives you real freedom when you don't have any expectation. You're not really trying to please anybody. I was just trying to write the book that I wanted to read. Um, and so after that, that's what I've done ever since. Even though there's more pressure to live up to the last book or for whatever it achieved, I just always remind myself, I just have to write the book that I really want to read. I can never please everybody. You can't please every reader. So you might as well not try to do that.
Right.
So I just try to tell the best story I can tell in the most honest way. And the key for me is to create characters that readers will care about. And that's something I learned really early on with Clay's Quilt was the characters are what people remember the most. That's what they care about. I mean, they might like the story and all that, but what they really, really take away from it is the love for a character or the frustration with the character or whatever.
Well, what is your writing schedule now? I know there are some aspiring writers out there, and I might ask you too if you have some advice for them. But what is your do you have a set schedule all the time, or when you're writing a book, you have a different schedule? How does that work out?
Um, well, let's say that, 2/3 of the writing of the book, I am just writing it whenever I can snatch a moment away. Just whenever I can write, I'm doing that. Being a writer is a lot like being a juggler, because my typical day is, um, I teach at Berea College. I teach in the Spalding School of Writing in their graduate program. So I'm tending to those students throughout the day. I'm taking care of business that writing presents of events that I'm doing, things like this. I'm doing just normal life things. Um, I'm traveling to go to places in normal times, in non-pandemic times, etc. So, I can't write in a hotel room. I've never been able to do that. Um, so usually I'm just snatching
Mhm.
time when I can. But then when I'm in the third part of the book, that's when I feel like that the momentum's really uh, I'm gaining momentum. And so then I start to set a real schedule where I'll try to write, I'll try to set a whole 5 or 6 hour block aside to write. Now, having said that, I never go to the page unless I have something to say. So one of the best things for me as a writer is walking. I always go for walks before I sit down to write. I get my best ideas when I'm walking. And I also work a lot outside. Um, we have just over an acre. And so, like the past few days, I've just been out there just trying to get all that situated, get the yard cleaned up. And that is such a productive time for me. Anytime that I'm outside working and, uh, building a garden or pulling limbs out or cleaning the creek out or whatever, that's writing time. So people think of writing time as just being at your laptop and putting words on the page. But for me, the most productive time is things like that. It's more about what's going on in my mind.
Right. And probably, would you say that that's almost half the book, or how much time do you think you spend? About half?
Oh, more, I would say.
Mm.
I would say way more. I would say 75% of it is just in my, in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
The real challenge is the time, finding the time to sit down and write. And so, when you're a working writer, as most writers are, most writers have other jobs. I mean, unless you're John Grisham or Stephen King, or, most writers are doing other things like that. Then you have to figure out how to be writing during other, while you're doing other stuff.
Right.
And that works really well for me. I wrote most of Clay's Quilt while I was carrying mail. I was a mail carrier for 7 years.
I think I remember that.
Yeah. And so I was out on the mail route all day, and I would be, you get to a certain point where you just know your mail route so well that you can almost you just barely glance at the mail and you put it in the mailbox and somehow it all gets delivered correctly. And so, I was deeply in thought about the book throughout the day, and I wouldn't take any notes or anything. I would just get it all in my head. And then when I got home, I would have all that to write. And so it just makes you feverishly write. And that's the way I like to do it.
That's amazing. Well, what would you say to somebody out there that does want to, has maybe a desire to do some writing, to write fiction? Of course, there's lots of, programs and educational opportunities, but what would you say to somebody if they're just out there, they're brand new and have never really even started the process?
Well, I mean, I think the main thing is just a no-brainer of you must be a voracious reader, and you also must be an eclectic reader. I mean, some of the best things I've learned about being a writer have been through reading books that were very different than the way I write, that were set in places very different than where I'm setting my work, So I read world literature. I'm not married to just one place or, one time period or whatever. I'm really constantly surprised by the number of people who come to writing classes of mine, and I'll ask them about their favorite books, and they'll tell me they just don't read much. And that would be like going out for the basketball team and never getting out there on the driveway and shooting the ball, So I can't stress enough to just be a voracious reader. But I took a lot of advantage of, we are really lucky in Kentucky to have a wealth of writing classes available to us. I mean, here in Lexington, the Carnegie Center, for instance, just is constantly providing classes like that. The Appalachian Writers Workshop at Hyman Settlement School was instrumental to me. It's just such an amazing experience to go through that. They have scholarships available. Sometimes people hesitate to go because it's a 7-day thing. But it's something that I encourage, if you're really serious about writing, to do that. To audit writing classes at colleges, if you're not in college and can't take them yourself. I mean, just find these writing classes. And really the pandemic has opened the world up too for people who want to write, because now so many of these classes we can attend online. You don't have to go to Colorado anymore to attend the Rocky Mountain Writers Conference or whatever. And I think that the pandemic has probably changed that forever in a big way. I think that a lot of these places are going to think we need to always have this for people that can't come, to have this option. So take classes, read, go to events. I learned so much by going to readings at bookstores and libraries. Our library system in Kentucky is so wonderful about providing all these authors that come in. I mean, I just see constantly writers coming in, and there's so much opportunity for us. And people out in the rest of the country are surprised by that. They think that, we're a cultural wasteland in Kentucky, and little do they know, how much we have at our fingertips. We do have so many opportunities. I feel like, one of the things that gave me the ability to be a writer is that I went to a reading that James Steele and Lee Smith did together in Hazard, Kentucky. And I sat and listened to them read their work, which I loved. And then I talked to them afterwards, and they were just encouraging. And one of the things they told me to do was go to the writer's workshop at Hyman. And I did, and it changed my life. And I tell students of mine, go to these readings and ask writers questions. Ask them about their process, and ask them about their agent. You have to be aggressive. The other thing is that a lot of times when people write, they also want to be published. And the really hard thing that for artists, I think, is to think about it from a business point of view. But at some point, you have to do that. You have to learn about the industry. And I think we resist that a lot. We just want to be artiste, and not worry about the marketing side of it. But you have to do it. So it's just part of the game. And so I encourage people to learn about that.
That's good. Yeah. It's not 30 years ago when you would get a publishing contract and they took care of everything, or 50 years ago. It's not Hemingway's time anymore. The different world. Well, I know you mentioned questions. I know Sarah's going to hop on here in a minute so that we can take some questions from the rest of the audience. But I was wondering, I have one more. I was wondering if you could tell me who your favorite Kentucky writer is, or no, I shouldn't say favorite. That's not fair. I'm going to say, you'll get in trouble if I ask that question. I'm going to say, which one has been the most influential in your career? And then also give me somebody outside of Kentucky.
That's a hard question. There's so many of them. I guess the two that were really the two Kentuckians who were so instrumental to me when I was first getting, really serious about this, were Bobby Ann Mason and Barbara Kingsolver, because I just disappeared into their books, and I remember reading In Country and just being so transported by that book. And then my favorite Bobby Ann Mason novel is Feather Crowns.
Oh, I love that book.
It's such an underrated novel. It should have won every award there is. James Steele had a big influence on me, of course, and Gurney Norman's Kinfolks is a book that I have read dozens of times. And Barbara Kingsolver is just a model for somebody who takes on the big issues, but makes it about the human story first and foremost. It was a major influence for me. Yeah. And then outside, Lee Smith has been my main writing mentor. She's from Grundy, Virginia, lives in North Carolina now, and it's just been so generous to me. Took me under her wing. Larry Brown from Mississippi really took me under his wing. So many, and then my favorite, the books that really made me a writer would be My Antonia by Willa Cather, Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy, and The Color Purple by Alice Walker. Those three books were mind-blowing for me.
Great choices. So I hope everybody out there wrote those down. You need to read those books. So thank you, Silas. And I'm going to turn it now over to Sarah. I so enjoyed this. I'm selfishly I'm glad this is being recorded because I'm going to go back and listen to some of the writing advice in particular. So,
Much, Angela.
Well, thank you both so much. I do have some questions from Facebook and from the Q&A. Angela did ask a few. So she asked how the books are connected: Parchment of Leaves, Cold Tattoo, and Clay's Quilt. So that was good to kind of hear how the books all work together. I have, well, gosh, seems like Angela, you got around to quite a few of these.
sure.
So one question from Robin is, how do you decide, this is for Silas, how do you decide whether and how to weave social issues like stereotypes of rural violence into fiction versus writing an essay or an article about it?
Well, again, I think for me, it's those things have to just come up naturally. You know, in Clay's Quilt, domestic violence is something that plays a big part in the book. I didn't want to write about that because that is a stereotype of Appalachian life. It's a stereotype of rural life, working class life. But the fact is, domestic violence is a fact of global life, and it happens in every culture, everywhere, you know. And so it's something that needs to be talked about, and it made sense for the book. And I felt like that I could explore that issue better in fiction than I couldn't have sat down and written an article or an essay about that and had the same power as creating a character that the reader hopefully cares about enough that they feel something about domestic violence in a different way because they've got another character. The main thing for me is anytime I'm taking on a social issue like that is sort of what I said about Barbara Kingsolver. You know, the most important thing is to make sure that the social issue doesn't become the main thing. The social issue is the foundation. It's sort of in the background, but the human story is the most important thing. The characters are the most important thing.
Sorry. Thank you, Silas. I'm having some technical difficulties over here. So you said that you do have a 7th book coming out. Could you share a little bit about what that book's about? I know 2022, right, is when it's supposed to be coming out.
Fall of 22. Well, it's a very different novel for me. It's a speculative novel. It's set a few years from now, maybe 10 or 20 years from now. And I thought so much about the fires in California. And then when Australia, you know, so much of Australia burned, I just couldn't stop thinking about that. And so I started thinking about how we as Americans feel like that's happening to somebody else. So in my novel, the fires have sort of taken over all of the United States and moved the whole population up into New England, and eventually people have to leave. And so this one family leaves and tries to get into Ireland on a refugee boat, and nobody on the boat survives except for one man, and he manages to get ashore to Ireland, and then the whole novel is about him walking across Ireland with a dog, with a beagle who does not bark. And so it's a lot about my love for dogs. It's very much an environmental novel, and about the way that, you know, we have to take care of the world we have. And like all my books, it's about family, created family, blood family. So thematically, it's very similar to what I've always written, but it's very different, mainly because it's set in Ireland, and because it's set a little bit in the future, which makes it hard to talk about, you know. So it's not like a science fiction or fantastical or anything. It just happens to be set a few years from now.
Sounds very interesting. I look forward to reading it. You have a beagle too, don't you?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
He's responsible for this novel. I could have never written it without him.
We love dogs. Ruth says that the opening scene in Clay's quilt instantly hooked her. She felt like she was talking along with the characters because she knew the dialogue. She says Buffalo Mountain is minutes away from her home where she's raised, so she was instantly drawn in. And she loved how you use the natural dialect as well. So she's asking if you plan any more spinoffs because she's curious about what happened to Aaron's daughter that moved to Tennessee. I hope that's not any spoilers.
Nah. I haven't thought about any more with that character from Parchment Leaves, but I have been thinking a lot about a sequel to Clay's Quilt, and I have it all in my mind. I just have to figure out a few things. I already know it's called Clay's Choice, and it's set contemporary. You know, when Clay's Quilt ends in 2001, he has a baby named Maggie. So Clay's Choice will sort of center around Maggie and her relationship with her father, with Clay. So it's a very different world, you know, in that 20 years that has passed in Appalachia. And I've thought a lot about how where I'm from has changed so much in that time. So I'd like to explore those changes, the way it's changed and the way it's stayed the same. So I hope to write that eventually.
Well, we will look forward to that. It seems like the three books, when they were re-released with Blair, with the new covers and everything, did you have any say in, because all the books, I mean, it looks so much like a set. Did you have any say in that, or was there any discussion about that?
Yeah, the publishers at Blair were just wonderful. I loved working with them. And they came up with the whole thing, you know, and then we went through some changes together, and I gave some things that I really wanted. I really love those upside down trees on the cover of the Coal Tattoo. I think that really captures the book. And of course, each book has its own color palette, right? Clay's Quilt has that blue cover, then Parchment Leaves is green, and the Coal Tattoo is red. And when you read those books, that all makes sense. All those colors really make sense. And I love the forewords that were written by Tyler Childers. Wrote one for Clay's Quilt, and I love Tyler Childers' music and the way it and the way he wrote about Clay's Quilt in the front of the book. And then Amy Green, a novelist I really respect, wrote a foreword for Parchment Leaves. So I just love what Blair did, and they let me write an essay about the use of music in the Coal Tattoo. So that's the supplement in that one.
And when the book, the content kind of speaks to the cover and vice versa. And then it's always fun to also, if the title specifically mentioned in the book, it's fun when you are reading and you stumble upon that. I had a question. I think it's Rick who sent it to me via email. He actually asked if you had done any quilting, Silas, or if you have any anecdotes from your family about quilting.
That would be a disaster because I can barely sew a button on a shirt, but I love quilts. And one thing that people always ask me about is that the main quilter in Clay's Quilt is a man. And so people are always fascinated by that. And that was totally based on my great uncle Dave, who was the quilter in our family. You know, if you had a baby, Uncle Dave always made the baby a quilt, or if you got married or whatever big occasion, Uncle Dave would make a quilt. And he said that he was, his mother, you know, never wanted anybody to be still. And in the wintertime, when his outdoor chores were fewer, when he had, you know, less to do with the animals and the farming and all that, she made him quilt. She taught him how to quilt. And so he sort of focused on the more utilitarian quilts, like quilts for the barn, for the animals, things like that. Quilts for the wagons. So they weren't like they weren't necessarily aesthetically masterpieces, but they were sturdy, and I mean, I think they're beautiful. They're some of my treasures to have. But yeah, he was really the main quilter. He and my granny on my father's side were quilters. So she always had a big quilt rack, you know, up at it would pull up to the top of the ceiling when you went into her house.
And it's something that's handmade like that, you know, it's going to last forever. So that's always really special. I've got one final question, and this is a good one. I don't think I've heard this one, Silas. Do you think your writing would have changed if you had left Kentucky, or was that never even a thought?
Hmm. Surely it probably would have in some way. I mean, when Clay's Quilt came out, I had barely been anywhere. I had flown one time, and that was just a year before the book tour. The farthest south I had been was, to Atlanta. The farthest north was Cincinnati. I mean, I had just not been anywhere. My family weren't traveling people. I was really country come to town on that first book tour. I could write a whole book about my first time experiences, because I went on a huge book tour with Clay's Quilt, and I really had a crash course in learning about the publishing industry and all that. I was really lucky because my publisher paired me up with Robert Morgan, and while we were on tour together, Oprah's book club chose his book. So we went from going to events and having 10 people to going to events and having 500 people, because suddenly my touring partner was on Oprah. So that gave me an audience too, and really gave me a test by fire that worked well for me. But I forgot the original question now. I'm sorry.
Do you think your writing would have changed if you had moved away from Kentucky? Yeah.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I mean, my writing has changed just because of experiencing more things, and I mean, just age. Yeah, of course, changes the experience of age, but also the experience of travel. I mean, I certainly couldn't have written a book set in Ireland if I hadn't spent a lot of time in Ireland. My last book, half of it is set in Key West. I really got to know Key West well, and things like that. So I think that's a really good thing when a writer can have these different facets. On one hand, I can never totally leave Kentucky, no matter what. I mean, my characters are always rooted in a working class rural world. Even if they go somewhere like Key West, they're seeing Key West through those eyes. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like I can ever write from a point of view of a Key Westerner or an Irish person. I'm always going to have that sensibility of a rural working class person. Before we run out of time, I did want to tell people that one thing I love about the new editions, they have a family tree in them. And so I love that you can see how all the characters for the whole trilogy are connected. And tentatively, we're going to have a big event on June 5th, somewhere in Lexington, probably at Joseph Beth in Lexington, to celebrate the 20th anniversary of Clay's Quilt. And so we'll have lots of supplemental stuff too there, broadside and a map of Crow County and just things like that. So I hope people might mark that on their calendars and watch my social media for notices about that.
Yeah, we will definitely be there. And I was going to suggest that people follow you on Instagram because you share fun anecdotes, and you've been sharing some pictures and stuff from your first tour.
Yeah.
There's also another quick anecdote before we close up. Martha Neal says that it's wonderful to hear your voice, and she hosted you 20 years ago for Clay's Quilt when it came out. So shout out to Martha.
Thank you. Those were great times that I had up there with you all.
Yeah.
So what a bookstore.
Good. Well, thank you. Thank you both so much, Silas and Angela. It looks like we're about out of time here, but thank you for a great conversation, and thanks to our sponsor, First Southern National Bank. We also want to thank you out there for joining us for this Kentucky Book Festival event. If you're interested in purchasing Clay's Quilt, please visit our independent bookstore partner, Joseph Beth Booksellers, at josephbeth.com. Visit them in store, and as Silas said, keep up with his social media for upcoming events at Joseph Beth. For upcoming Kentucky Book Festival events, please visit our website, kybookfestival.org, and follow at KY Humanities on social media. Please take a few moments to fill out the survey that will appear on your screen when this webinar has ended. For Kentucky Humanities, I'm Sarah Woods. See you next time.